Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Anastasia, and I am the events manager for Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Cafe. We're so glad to have you here at tonight's virtual event, and I just have a few quick pieces of business to go over before we get started. There are some quick setting modifications that we encourage you to make on Zoom that'll make the event experience a little more interactive. We encourage you to hit escape full screen, which will scale the size of the Zoom down and show you your control panel. And that will allow you to activate the chat and the Q&A features, which you should see right at the bottom of the Zoom screen. If you'd like to participate in the chat, you can set your setting to all panelists and attendees. And we encourage you to chat in during the event, say hi, let us know where you're viewing from. We just ask that you adhere to our virtual event code of conduct, which has been posted in the chat. You can also ask questions in the Q&A module. It looks like someone's already asked a question, which is awesome. So keep asking questions throughout the event. And then you can also upvote those questions to highlight the ones that are most interesting. And we will get to audience questions during the second half of the event. If you're joining us tonight from Facebook Live, thank you so much for tuning in. We'll do our best to filter your comments, but to really join the conversation, come join us on Zoom. There is a link in the description of the video that will bring you over here to the Zoom conversation. The event will be recorded, so if you have to leave or you come in late, the recording will be available at a later date. If you'd like to order a copy of tonight's event book, we will be posting links in the chat throughout the event. This will take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Books ordered through the event tonight will come with a signed book plate from Emily while supplies last. And I highly recommend you get your own copy of All Girls. The book is fabulous and it has such a beautiful cover, so don't miss out on this one. And with that, I am delighted to introduce Emily Layden tonight to discuss her debut novel, All Girls, as a part of our Read of the Day event series, which is a partnership between Bank Square Books and The Day. Emily will be joined by Julia Bergman, a reporter of The Day. Emily Layden is a writer and former high school English teacher from upstate New York. A graduate of Stanford University, her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Marie Claire, The Billfold, and Runner's World. All Girls is her first novel. The book has received a great deal of praise, and I'd like to read you Carola Levering, who is our March read of the day, her blurb about the book. Carola says of All Girls, characters who feel as real as your best friends, and I couldn't agree with that description more. Speaking with Emily today is Julia Bergman, who is the defense military reporter for The Day. Julia received her bachelor's degree in journalism from Indiana University Bloomington and has been working at The Day for about 6 years. We're delighted to have them both this evening. And before they kick off their conversation, Emily is actually going to come on and read the prologue of the book. So I'll have Emily come up on screen now, and you'll get to listen to her read a little bit of All Girls. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me and for supporting this book. So I'm just going to read right from the top of the novel, which functions as a kind of prologue and situates us in kind of the where and why of the story. There are no major highways into the northwest corner of Connecticut that comprises Litchfield County. Travelers from the more densely populated suburbs of New York, from Westchester and Long Island, from Danbury and Greenwich, find themselves frustrated by the path of winnowing thoroughfares, turnpikes and interstates splitting again and again like capillaries from an artery. No matter the starting point, the final approach to Atwater requires navigating Litchfield's web of two-lane county roads, flanked in most cases by farmland and medium-thick deciduous forest, the only signage suggesting lowered speeds around particularly treacherous curves. In this corner of New England, like the PCH in certain parts of Southern California, like the pavement that cuts between oil fields outside Odessa, these are the roads meant for windows down and music on loud. This is where teenagers wrap themselves around telephone poles. The vandal, if vandalism is what you wanted to call it, clearly knew this when she considered her options. Unlike the question of whether the act was vandalism, there was near unanimous agreement that the culprit was, in fact, a she. She clearly knew that families dropping their daughters off at school had their pick of county routes to zig and zag across, like ants to the nest. She might have also known that the nearest billboards were at the interchanges and highway overpasses near Waterbury and Hartford. She might have further estimated the number of students who drove that way and decided not enough. When she placed her order with Vistaprint, the label was printed neatly on the back of each poster board for 118 by 27-inch signs and 100 stands. It was with the understanding that the best approach was a scattershot one, shrapnel blasted across the entire county. She likely researched Connecticut laws and local ordinances regarding yard signs and public property and determined that what she was planning was probably not illegal, not exactly, but that it was best to plant the signs under the cover of darkness on a night as close to opening day as possible. And so when the residents of Kent and Goshen and Roxbury woke one morning in late August, the day the boarding school at the heart of their suburban rural community was set to open for the academic year, and made their way to the little main streets and intersections that held their corner stores and gas stations, they found their roads peppered with little black rectangles, low and squat and set 30 feet from the pavement. It wasn't until they passed 2 or 3 that the words coalesced into meaning, the R's and P's sorted and organized by a fogged morning brain. Longer still, it took to identify the purpose of these campaign signs in a non-election year. And so the phrasing of the placards planted like seeds in a 15-mile radius from the Atwater School settled confusedly onto the surrounding community. A rapist works here, they read, the message positioned next to a sepia-toned photo of a schoolhouse steeple, haloed in black like an antique portrait. They were gone almost as soon as they'd popped up, lingering only for a day or two, so that those that remained withered like mailbox balloons after a birthday party, wilted and random, more frequent the farther you traveled from campus. They guessed the school came around and tore them up, or maybe it was their neighbors for whom the vulgarity of the signs was too much. Who wanted to look at that word every day? Who wanted to think about that kind of violence? Because of this, few of them had the chance to look up the URL that slugged to the bottom of each sign, the one that might have directed them to a petition to extend Connecticut's statute of limitations on rape and sexual assault, a kind of activism that might have struck them as surprisingly reasonable given the shock of the headline and tabloidishness of the signs. In time, the townspeople for whom Atwater was a kind of ivory tower would decide the words on the yard signs weren't meant for them, not really, and the act of vigilante justice would fade in their memories to a kind of sad and misguided prank. They were used to this kind of thing, the whispers of scandal that accompany the very, very privileged. It was never any of their business.
Thanks so much for reading that, Emily, and happy to have this conversation with you tonight. And thank you to Bank Square Books, our partner in this series of events. So we learn about this allegation of rape that you just read about. It comes from a former student of school, and we read about it. We learn about it in the first pages of the book, but it doesn't actually dominate the narrative going forward as far as the reader getting the details of what happened. Instead, the story follows how the news of the allegation impacts the women who go to the all-girls boarding school, where the male faculty member who's the subject of this accusation is still teaching. So can you talk about your decision to write the book that way?
Yeah, so to me, the book is really a novel about ripple effects, right? Like the scandal and the 1995 rape, that's just like the rock out in the middle of the lake. And the book is really about all of the waves coming off of that. And those waves are the girls and their experiences, but also like their psychology, right? How does this scandal sort of weigh on them or burden them or consume them while they're also going about the regular business of being a teenage girl, while they're also just navigating the kind of social mores of prep school life, right?
Yeah, definitely. And you dedicate the book actually to young women who you say deserve to have their experiences seen more fully. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that in so many ways, right, teenage girls, they drive our discourse and they shape our culture. They tell us like what's cool and what to wear and what music to listen to. But they're rarely really given credit for their full personhood. And I think that I wanted to try to write something that, above all else, honored the experience of teenage girlhood in like all its depth and capacity.
And we should mention that you actually taught at several all-girls schools, and the school in this book is obviously fictitious, but you obviously had that experience. And I actually see the book sort of as a commentary on transparency and how these allegations are handled at these institutions. And I'm wondering, from your experience, whether you found that to be the case that, kind of generally at these institutions, that there's maybe an issue with transparency.
Yeah, I think that in my experience, right, the people who work at girls' schools, myself included, really believe in the promise of girls' schools, right? The power of the proverbial room of one's own and the confidence building benefits of single gender education. And the truth is that many of these schools, a place like Atwater included, when they were founded, they were really revolutionary, right? It was a remarkable thing for a woman to go to school. And I think that one of the tragedies of the book that I do feel is honest and accurate in real life is that, or how these places can come to lose sight of their founding principles, right? So how does a place built to empower women become a place that silences them, that prioritizes, how do they come to prioritize institutions over individuals? So it's that loss of legacy, I think, that I'm writing about, or loss of attention to legacy a bit.
And do you feel in a way that your book is sort of giving a voice to those young women who often can be silenced at these schools despite their, obviously best efforts to try to empower them and what they want to do with their lives?
I think I'm trying to do that. I hope that when, it is an adult book, it's not YA, but certainly I think I already know some teenage girls who are reading it, and I do hope that they see themselves taken seriously on the page.
And have you heard from any of your former students? Have any of them read the book, and what are their thoughts, if so?
Yeah, they are. Several of them are reading it like right now and texting me pictures of it. I got one from a student today, like who goes to a school with a uniform, and it was like her plaid kilt against the book cover. It's different with them because they know me, and so they're also reacting to my work, to me on the page, as opposed to just like themselves, like their experiences reflected on the page. So I don't know, but I hope that as the weeks go on, I start to meet girls who are not my students who can tell me what they think.
But I'm sure you maybe drew some inspiration from your own experiences teaching at these institutions, and also maybe from the girls themselves who you encountered along the way.
Well, I think, have I had students who've struggled with clinical anxiety, as Macy does in the book? Like, yes, of course. Have I had students who felt outside their peers due to their socioeconomic status? Like, yes, of course. Have I had students who have sort of been held up by their schools as the model minority, like Olivia in the book? Like, yes, of course. I think that the reason the book is resonating or has had the kind of reaction I've gotten already, right, is that those are unique and specific experiences. And I think that sort of creating that level of verisimilitude is really like my job as a writer.
And you just referenced several characters. There's not a single protagonist in this book. It follows the stories of several different girls at the school. And, what was behind that decision, your decision to do that?
Yeah, I never thought of this as a single protagonist novel. There were just too many stories that I wanted to tell, and it felt unreasonable to burden a single character with all that I wanted to say. I think I felt I could achieve like deeper wells, so a greater exploration of mental illness or trauma or sexuality if I use multiple vignettes. And I think also another thing I'm trying to do here is provide a portrait of a community, not just a single person.
And the story obviously takes place in Connecticut in Litchfield County. And I'm curious, I'm sure many of the people watching tonight are as well, how you settled upon Connecticut, and did you spend time researching the book here?
Well, you guys have like more boarding schools per square mile than like any other state, right? You sort of, if I were to take that drive from where I live in upstate New York over across the border, right into Litchfield, it's like just they're every 5 miles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of it, just that it felt like the most realistic place to put this school. And I did, yeah. I mean, I took a couple of day trips, but I have family who lives in Connecticut, so it's not like it's totally foreign territory to me.
As a reporter, I appreciated the references to the zoning in the beginning about, the person who put up the sign knowing exactly what the Connecticut zoning laws and where they could put up this.
And I don't know if that was like maybe that was me.
You heard it from family members or something?
Well, yeah. No, I felt like I had to research that. Like,
got it.
Loud. Yeah. Like, I don't know. Probably no one reading would have ever questioned that. But.
It worked. So I know you spoke with my colleague Rick Koster, and you mentioned to him you didn't set out to write a novel about the Me Too movement, which is obviously widely known about now, and the book actually takes place several years before the movement took place. But do you see the book now that it's published as sort of being part of that larger dialogue surrounding Me Too?
Of course. I think that once you publish a book, you stop having control over where or how people want to talk about it, and that's just part of the deal. I think that I set out to write a book about girlhood, and perhaps unfortunately, a lot of the stories that we talk about when we talk about the Me Too movement are common to teenage girlhood. Right? When we talk about power and agency and consent, those are really real questions and thoughts for young women, I think.
And the subject of consent comes up a lot, I feel like, in the book, not just around this allegation, but in these girls' day-to-day lives and what they're encountering at the school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that one of the things that's so interesting about high school girls and this conversation about consent is that one of the things that I think that 16, 17, 18-year-olds right now are really aware of is that when we talk about agency and power, what we're also talking about for them is, or what we're saying is, because you're 17, you can't have consented. Because you're 17, you didn't have any agency. And what do you do with that as a 17-year-old girl who presumably does have her own, like, is figuring out her own sexuality and her own desire? That's like a complicated thing to wrestle with in your own head, right?
Definitely. And I read that the original title of the book was supposed to be Legacy, and then you switched it to All Girls. Can you give us sort of the behind the scenes about that?
Yeah, I just think that and a brilliant young woman named Hannah Nesbitt came up with the title All Girls at St. Martin's. So a huge thanks to her. I think that Legacy captures some things about the book, right? It is a story about what we pass on, what we inherit, what we aim to preserve. But that's not really the heart of the book. The heart of the book is the girls. And I think that this is just a better fitting title.
And how did you, backing up a little bit, how did you even decide that this was something that you wanted to write a novel about, and your first novel about?
Well, I think that we just tell the stories we have, right? And I was, I spent most of my 20s, as you said, teaching in various boarding and independent day schools. And I really did. I loved teaching. Like, it's such a privilege to get to sit in a classroom and talk about books all day. But really, most of all, I love my students. And the girls just, like, they impressed me daily with their wisdom and their optimism and their incredible capacity for empathy. And I think after years in the trenches with them, I think I just wanted to write something that honored their experience.
And we talked earlier actually about the fact that you're a big runner, and I'm curious if that factored into your writing process at all, if that was helpful at all to go on runs and maybe think through things. Or
yeah, I actually just wrote a piece for Women's Running about that today, so everybody can go Google it if you want to read. I see my running and my writing as totally symbiotic. The skills and talents that I have for one help with the other, right? Like the discipline, the reliance on routine, right? That translates. But I do think that it is, when I run, I don't think about nothing. I'm not one of those people whose mind just goes blank. But I think in a kind of meditative way. And certainly that process of thinking clearly, that, of course, that helps my creativity.
Yeah, it's kind of a train of thought. Yeah, as you're running.
Yeah. Sometimes you wish you had a pen with you, But,
yeah, exactly.
If they're really good ideas, they'll stick.
Right. And you were a writer before, I believe, before writing this book, writing for New York Times and other publications, and just curious about the transition from writing for those kind of publications to a novel and now being an author.
Well, I think that this is an interesting question. I think that because it's like where to start. I think that the truth is that writing a novel was something I could do in an intentional daily way. I got up every morning and wrote from 5 to 6 a.m. before I went to teach. And it was just like methodically chipping away at it. The freelance grind requires a different level or just a different approach to the work. You need to be slightly more nimble and able to work more tapped into the news or the zeitgeist. And this, I was teaching, I had another job, and this novel was something that I could do overall without having to pay attention to some noise, I think.
And I'm curious, do you have a favorite character in the book, or is there a character that you really resonate with or see yourself in?
I get that question all the time.
I'm sure.
And I actually had a friend text me yesterday and say that she wants there to be a BuzzFeed quiz. It's like, which Atwater girl are you? I think the truth is that there is a little bit of me in all of the girls, right? I am a runner like Macy. I think what I hope for the book is that even if you aren't a runner, or you aren't struggling with your socioeconomic status in relation to your peers, or if you aren't wondering about the contours of your sexuality, that you might still read these characters and feel like you know what it is to want to be seen or to want to be understood. That I think is the goal, that there's like a universal connection in each of the girls.
Or do your friends or family just like unsolicited tell you, well, actually, I think you're this character in the end?
Some people have definitely done that.
This is obviously your debut novel. I'm sure people are wondering if you're working on anything else right now, or what might be next for you.
Yeah, I am writing. I really believe in sort of the creative cocoon a little bit, that I have to protect what I'm talking about until I'm ready to talk about it. I think I can say that I'm working on two things. One is kind of a multi-generational family narrative in the vein of like Everything I Never Told You, and another is kind of an exploration of like female ambition.
Interesting.
It's sufficiently vague, but that's
yes. That will enough so to keep people interested. Getting back to the book, another common theme that I noticed was accountability, and I'm wondering sort of how important it was for you to include that in there. Related to the allegation, there are some people who resign their positions over the course of the book, and wondering if you saw that as sort of a level of accountability in what happened.
I think what's interesting about that, without I'm talking around spoilers here, but I think what's interesting, right, is that the girls struggle with what level of accountability they were looking for or are looking for. And I think that it's because it's not just that accountability is necessary, but it's that a whole sort of sweeping change in how we talk about these stories and these experiences is what these girls are really looking for. They really want to be just taken seriously, right? And that is, it almost feels like it's just having somebody resign, or a couple of somebody's resign. It weirdly doesn't feel like enough to them, because it doesn't feel like it will, more than they want the heads to fall, they want to feel like they matter. And those are different things. People can be fired, people can resign. That doesn't necessarily mean that there will be change to come.
And I'm curious, I always am curious about this with writers. I mean, when you set out to write the book, did you know how it was going to end? Again, without sort of giving any spoilers, but did you kind of have the ending set in your mind?
I did, which is a totally bonkers experience for me. I think that, this is my debut novel, but in any other writing I've done, undergraduate seminars, I would have no idea where something was going. But I think that the nature of this book, which has parallel plot lines happening, right? I had to know where we were going to be able to lay the rest of the planks down.
And it took place over a full year, and I imagine that was by design too. You kind of wanted to maybe show more of an arc to these girls beyond just sort of a one incident. Yeah,
and also the school is as much a character as the girls are, right? And so I think that I needed to show all these things that make up a school, all of these, the daily rhythms, the traditions, the dining hall, those little details that make a place feel real. I think that was as much a thing I was trying to draw as Lauren or Macy or Olivia.
And how quickly did it take, or how long did it take for you to write the book? I know people are always curious about that.
I know, and I feel bad answering because I just want to say, if you're a writer, it's whatever it takes. It takes the time it takes. If it takes you a year, if it takes you 10, like, it's fine. I wrote the first draft of this pretty quickly, in about a year, and then I did a round of revisions in another few months, and then about 6 weeks of revisions with my agent before we sold it.
Got it. Well, there's other people that want to ask questions here, so I'm going to turn it over to Anastasia to get to some of those, and then maybe we can get back to some of my questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julia. Those were great questions. And as we get to audience questions, which we've got quite a few of, I just want to point out, in terms of how long it took Emily to write the book, you also had a very meteoric buy of this book. Can you tell us just briefly, as I sort of cue the questions here, how that happened? Because it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I did have the very good fortune of we sold this book in 24 hours, which is remarkable and made me feel like I wanted to vomit at my desk when my agent called. But I'm just really grateful that my editor Sarah saw something in it and that it clicked with her so quickly, and that we're here now.
Yeah, absolutely. And did I hear that it's been optioned for TV film?
It has been optioned. Yeah.
Yeah. Can't wait for that. Can't wait for that. Okay, so let's get to some of these audience questions. And even though the audience has been quiet in the chat, they have been asking up a storm of questions, which is amazing. So let's see. Let's start off with Lori's question. She says, it's so interesting to hear about parts of your background, and she'd love to hear more about your background and what specifically inspired you to write this, perhaps maybe not your teaching experiences, and whether or not you always wanted to be a writer.
Yeah, so I do come from a family of writers. My dad's a writer, my uncle's a writer, my cousin is a TV writer, and we were the kind of family who would we would go on family vacations, and my cousin and I would like write little plays and perform them for everyone. And so, yeah, it was just that like storytelling was always encouraged and valued. And I think that I always felt, Julia asked me about running, and I've always felt like a runner, I have always also felt like a writer. Like writing just feels like how I make sense of the world. Yeah, so in that sense, that I guess that's the deepest, longest running. Like if you were to ask me like to tell my origin story with this novel from the very beginning, it's that, yeah, I feel like I've always been a writer and I've always wanted to write a book.
Yeah, I love that. And Joseph actually has a question that really falls well in line with that. What style of writing are you most comfortable with?
What style of writing? Interesting. Well, I wish I could ask Joseph a follow-up, which is like, what do you mean?
Well, if Joseph is typing, we can let him follow that up. But maybe like, do you feel like this book was like a really great example of what you feel like your wheelhouse is, or do you enjoy writing more mysterious or perhaps some shorter prose?
I've always been drawn to books and that are novels written for adults that nonetheless center young people and render them as like whole, full humans. So I'm thinking of, Celeste Ng does this really well. Jesmyn Ward does it. Curtis Sittenfeld, Emma Cline. These writers who are clearly writing for an adult audience, but who are diving into the hearts and minds of young people. That does feel like my wheelhouse, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, so back to sort of the subject of the book, Sue asks, why did you choose to set the book in 2015, 2016, as opposed to a little more present? Was it when you were writing it, or was that intentional?
Yeah. Well, the truth is that I initially said it in 2015 because I didn't want to have to write about Donald Trump, right? Like, just like writers now are like, I don't want to have to write about a pandemic, so we're not setting it in 2020. That's like where it started. Just a desire to not have to make a commentary on the biggest thing in the room. But then, as I was working, kind of in 2017, 2018, what is time now? I felt like it was important that my book was set before the Me Too movement, because the girls, if it had happened during the Me Too movement, the girls would have been equipped with a set of language and a sort of a playbook that they could have looked to use. And I wanted to write about the fumbling for justice. Yeah, I think.
Yeah, that's incredible. And Julia, feel free to jump here, because I'd actually love to talk about this a little bit more. I think that is such an incredible observation that you made, and a really significant intentional choice, because it is truly remarkable that 4 or 5 years of time has made such a huge difference in how so many groups of people see themselves and feel the agency to represent themselves, stand up for themselves, all of this. And I think it's really important. And how has that felt as you've had early response to the book, or now that it's been out for a couple days? Like, do you feel like your choice has been really validated?
I think that you're right that so much has changed in 5 years, 4 years. But it is still a conversation. There's still so much growth and change that needs to happen. And so I think that, if anything, I just see my book as another resource that can be used as we try to, as we go about the business of making change, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and something, I noticed on that topic in the book is that when there did come to be a real formal school-wide discussion about it, that was at the discretion of the school leadership, and that when actually the students wanted to kind of comment on it in their own way, not giving anything, don't want to give up too much information, but that was shut down. And so, that seemed to me to be also really, really crucial part of the book.
Yeah, it's not unlike your question about resignations and accountability, right? It's what does it look like for really, what does real change mean? And it does mean shaking up who gets a seat at the table, and how we converse once we're at that table.
And I think also too, before we go back to the questions from the audience, but to that point, I mean, I think that often sometimes people also dismiss young people as like, oh, they're young, they don't know anything. And I think your book reinforces that that's not true, that these women do have, very, very deep thoughts of their own that, that can contribute to this larger conversation.
Oh my God, absolutely. And, I think we do see that, right? Like I'm thinking about like the Parkland kids, right? Like just like how endlessly impressive they were with their public platform. It's like true that teenagers have like, hyperreactive amygdalae and like underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes, right? So they like are children, but they're still whole humans. And that means they still deserve to be listened to and valued and taken seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one more sort of comment on this topic. I think I think about the girls in the book, and I think the three of us are of a fairly similar age bracket here. And I don't know that you ever forget what it was like to be a teenager, right? And this year, especially with the fact that we've all been stuck inside and the uprising of things like TikTok and whatnot, there's been all of these comments about like how teenagers are so different in 2020, 2021 than they were 5, 10, whatever years ago. And I can agree with that, because I remember my life in high school, and it was not like, you didn't have the luxury of having a perfectly airbrushed face, right? But, I read these girls and I'm like, they're so strong and they are so themselves. And you mentioned the Parkland kids, and I think that there's something really remarkable about these kids that are coming up right now. And I imagine you've probably seen that as a teacher in these prestigious schools. Can you talk a little bit about sort of that experience of getting to watch this, and like, you're in the microcosm of them gaining their voice, but you're kind of on the outside as a teacher, right?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. And it's interesting, because you mentioned TikTok, right? And there's obviously a heavy use of social media in this book, because that's like real. But there are all these ways, that well-documented ways, that like social media is terrible, right? And anxiety provoking. And certainly we see that there's a ton of anxiety in the book, a lot of comparison culture. But which is just to say that I don't know if teenagers now are necessarily more confident and assured than they were 10 or 20 or 50 years ago. I don't know, because our hindsight clouds things. I suspect that like girls have always been kind and empathetic and optimistic and powerful, or eager to pursue their power regardless of time.
Yeah, I think you capture girlhood so beautifully and powerfully in the book. And I don't think anyone could disagree with that. So speaking just a little bit more on the schools, Suzanne asks if you actually visited any of the Connecticut boarding schools while writing this book.
I did, actually. I won't say which one. But yeah.
There you have it, Suzanne. And as Emily has been promoting this event tonight, which, thank you so much for sharing about the event. We're so glad to have all of you here this evening. She has mentioned multiple times that we should call her out on what might not be right about Connecticut. And I have to say, I don't have a lot of calling out to do. I grew up here, and while I grew up on the shoreline, I definitely feel like you captured it pretty well. And as someone who did tour some of those boarding schools in potential anticipation of not going to public high school, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head.
Thank you. I did a lot of like using like Google Street View to make sure I was getting particular geography right if I couldn't remember. Yeah.
Oh my God, I love that.
But thank you.
So Sue asks, she noticed that Chloe Benjamin blurbed the book, and that was what led her to picking it up. And she just wants to know, have you been able to develop relationships with a lot of the people that blurbed your book? Are you friends with Chloe? That's what she asks. You don't have to disclose your friendships, but the people are dying to know.
Yeah, Chloe's incredible. She's a remarkable literary citizen. She's really generous and with her time and with her support of new and young writers, and so are all of the women who blurbed my book, and who have continued to support me and it on this whole journey. So yeah, I have like a whole new cast of people in my life. And that has been just nothing but an incredible privilege to meet people like Chloe.
I love
Sorry,
the
I'm just jumping
phrase
in one more
literary
time.
citizen. Oh, go ahead, Julia.
I just was curious, Emily, sort of what books you read growing up and what authors maybe you kind of have always admired.
Oh, well, I already said some of them when I was talking about my wheelhouse. Yeah. So, you know, but I think that the ones I always come back to are Toni Morrison. I just reread her stuff. It's her birthday today, by the way. Happy birthday, Toni Morrison.
Happy birthday, Toni Morrison.
Happy birthday, yes.
So I always come back to Toni Morrison. And then I read poetry as kind of like a meditative exercise, I think. I don't necessarily, I'm not a poet, I can't write poetry, but Mary Oliver is very soothing to me. And Emily Dickinson, who has the epigraph of the book, is just, I'm staring at her. I've got her collection right on my desk. Yeah, are just repeat reads for me.
Yeah, absolutely. So while we're on the subject of reading, I feel like I can't get through a virtual event without asking this question. And since we're still in a global pandemic, I would love to know, what have you been reading more presently? Like, what were your quarantine reads? Did you have a favorite book that you've read in the last, God, it's almost going on 12 months now that we've been doing this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So right now I'm reading How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House by Sherry Jones. Also a debut, I believe. It's great. It's another sort of polyphonic novel that's really kind of dazzlingly kaleidoscopic, and it's like depiction of community. So it shares a little DNA with my book. And Robert Jones was a Prophet was what everyone has already said about it. It's beautiful and, you know, a little heavy for the time we're in. But so it's kind of a book I had to read more slowly than a book like The Push. I inhaled The Push, Ashley Audrey, I read that book in like one day. Yeah, so there's some recent ones.
Cool, awesome. So Suzanne has our final audience question, and then Julie, if you have any more, we can throw them in there too. You talked a little bit about what it's been like to write a novel. We have a lot of people who are interested in writing that come to these events. We have a very writerly community. And she's curious to know what your routine or schedule has been like or was like when you were writing this book.
Yeah, so when I was writing this novel, I was also teaching. So I got up every morning at 5 a.m. and I wrote for 1 hour. My dad once told me, and this could be like totally apocryphal and not true at all, and just like dad advice, that Stephen King said that if you write a page a day, after a year, you'll have a novel, which is true. And so that was just the kind of disciplined approach I had to take, methodical approach I had to take, because that was all my schedule allowed. Now I'm a full-time writer, and working on a few different projects, so my routine is a little bit different. But I think a great place to start is just with a daily practice.
How about any cures for procrastination during the pandemic when it comes to writing?
It's so hard. You know, I think I think the flip side to what I've just said, and Julia, you'll appreciate this as a runner yourself, but you can't run every day, right? Like you need rest days. And I think that writing is the same way. I think you also need to give yourself space from your project. And I think it's a hard, uncertain time right now. And it would be great if we can just be gentle with ourselves and adjusting to it.
And I'll do one more question. My editor always asks people this at the end of her interview, so I'll steal this from her, which is, what is something that you want me to know that I didn't ask you about either you or the book?
Oh, Well, I think I already said it, but I'm a huge Emily Dickinson fan, and if the epigraph of the book I think doesn't hit for you right away because her writing can be, can feel strange and tentative or not super approachable. I think that always just give it a second read or a third read, or when you finish the novel, come back to it and see if that language hits it all differently.
I actually just flipped back to the epigraph, and I've been kind of flipping through the book as you guys have been talking. And, to all of our audience out there, I strongly encourage you to buy a copy of the book. We always encourage you to buy a copy of the book when you come to these events, but I have a particular stake in this one because this has definitely been my favorite read of the last 6 months. And I read the last paragraph and my heart broke a little bit. And then I just read the epigraph again and it broke a little bit more, and not in a heartbreaking way, but just truly the feeling you have of growing up. But the book is beautiful, and thank you to Julia and Emily. I dropped a link in the chat where you can buy a copy of All Girls. Do you guys have any last words before we conclude this evening?
I don't think so. I'll let Emily say the last word, but thank you so much, Emily, for joining us. These are always really fun events, so we really appreciate it.
Yeah, and that's all I want to say too. Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Anastasia, for having me and for loving this book. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely, and thank you to our audience. We appreciate you coming out to these Read of the Day events. And just a little plug, our next event is on Wednesday, March 3rd with Carol Loverling, who also blurbed Emily's book. So keep an eye out for that. Thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening.
All right, have a good night.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.